So then without further ado, let's get to why y'all came here today. We're talking Data Governance 101 for discussion. What is data governance and why do we call it that? Why is it important? What value is it actually going to bring? Because after all, we're not going to go spend a business's or a hospital's money on something that doesn't add value. How we can start on implementing it and what it looks like at those different stages. And then lastly, to kind of warn you about some of the risks that these programs can run into if we're not careful. Now, during this presentation, please feel free to simply raise your hand, interrupt me, shout out your questions. It'll be a lot more fun and engaging that way. And I'll do my best to answer anything that I actually know. And if I don't, I'll write down the question and get back to you. Sound good? Excellent. So, without further ado, what is data governance? So, by and large, data governance actually comprises three major aspects. And this is actually the same thing for just about any business level transformation you'll run into. People, process, technology. And in that order. The trick here is that it's not actually as easy to describe it going from people, process, technology, despite the fact that the thing that is most important in making a data governance aspect successful is the people. So I'm going to start you back with the technology, which is easy, it's concrete. We can start and talk about what it looks like to get the technology set in place to enable effective data governance. Now, the best place to go look for this resource is DAMA, Data Admin Management Association. They write up great papers. They have entire basically books, I kid you not, books, yay thick, on how to go about managing access and control of your data. They'll talk about pieces like, what's the model? Do you have to have a patient record that exists before you can have a treatment? Or are you going to have some other record that has to exist? Where do these come from? It'll talk to you about where you're going to store it. Do you need to have the last 3 months' data easily accessible? Or can it go off to a data warehouse that takes a week to get data from? It'll talk about data security. Who's supposed to have access? When? Are they allowed to change it? And how do you know they changed it? Because that, unfortunately, ends up being an incredibly important aspect about data, which is the security of it. It'll talk about integration and interoperability. After all, every day we work with at least 3 or 4 different systems with our data. I've got one in my pocket. I've got one sitting on this desk. If you're working with more than one program from a different vendor, you've got at least 2. How these programs interact together, which program is the input for the main record, who can manage it from there, what that program allows you to do, actually has a pretty big impact on how effectively you can use and maintain your data. Of course, that comes then, of course, with document and content management. You've got a signature form that you're getting from your patients. We're probably scanning that in. Where does that get stored? How does it get stored? How do I make certain I have the appropriate version of that if that patient had to come back to the hospital and sign another updated form? And then, of course, you've got all the reference and the master data so that you can have meaningful codes going across your entire group. If the code for, penicillin is this over in ER and that over in neonatal, maybe there's a problem, and making certain that you're delivering the correct medication in the correct amounts could get very squirrely. Of course, I mentioned data warehousing. How are you going to store it? But more critically, how are you going to use it? Because data stored mostly is a liability. What happens if someone gets into it? How can you turn that from being simply a liability on the ledger that the company has to just maintain for years and years and years in case an auditor comes and asks, and turn that into information that can be made into a decision, informed decision, for management to drive the hospital forward? And of course, we have the data quality question. Everyone makes typos. Sometimes users, they're scrolling in something, and when I scan it, my optical character recognition thinks that a Y was actually an M, or goodness knows what other things can happen when you have signatures involved. And so you need to make certain that your data is of a quality that it can be used. Can you trust it? Which then leads us to this question about, okay, so what about the process side? Because all of those are the technologies, the things I'm using to support what I'm actually trying to do. Process could be intake. How do I get a new record created? How do I know it's accurate? It could be, how do I know that these records across 3 different departments, the anesthesiologist, the surgeon, and billing, are all connected to the same person, so I'm billing the correct person for the correct procedure? It deals with transparency. How much is billing actually allowed to know? Do they need to know like the actual transcript records from the surgery, or do they really just need to know the outcome and who was involved? How much do you need to know deals then with access control. Which people are actually allowed to know? Now this one may sound like, oh, well that should be easy. But be careful. There was a story not too long back where one of the ER nurses for, I want to think it was Ben Taub, got in a car accident. And all of her friends in the ER got very concerned about her. And so trying to keep tabs on how she was doing because they were worried, they looked at her record because she had been brought back to the hospital and checked in and was in, being seen care. She was there for about a week. She turned out okay. But do y'all hear the data violation that happened there? Yeah. All of them got fired because they had violated patient protocols. They had no need to know that information. They weren't her nurse. They were just curious. Would that story have happened if we had had broader data access control in place? They weren't even on the floor she was being seen in, so why would they have access to those records? Change management. Who's allowed to make a change to the record? And how do you know they made it? Because you don't want a hacker getting in and changing, the name of the new baby who was just born to Billy Joe Bob because he thinks it's funny. You'll need to be able to keep a meaningful record of, the data entry clerk who's supposed to enter new baby forms was the one who actually entered this. And there was a correction submitted by the parents later. Okay, cool. All of that checks out. But you have to keep in mind, access control and change management together need to work together. They need to know who has the roles for what, when they can get there, because third parties sometimes come and help out with your systems. I used to work for a telemedicine company that would remotely monitor cardiac monitors. And so anytime a cardiac event would happen, we'd create a report and throw it into the electronic medical record system of the doctor of that patient. That third-party integration meant I could change data on their system. You need to know I'm doing that. Because 60% of all the data breaches that you're going to run into, according to Reciprocity and several other news sites, ends up being from a third party on my end. You need control on yours to know who made the changes, so that if something happens where I couldn't control it well enough, or a mistake happened in my programming, you can know where it came from and actually understand the nature of the breach. We've all seen those things where Experian or others have a data breach and they can tell you, here was the size, here are all the records that might have been exposed. Being able to do that is a necessary thing to protect the interests of the people whose data you're storing. And of course, we have lifecycle management. This comes with, so both the data and the systems. We're not going to use the systems that we started with today 40 years from now. We'll have better ones, we'll have new ones. Those technologies won't be supported anymore. The data itself, though, also needs to be considered for lifecycle. How many of you are familiar with GDPR? Okay, we got one or two in the room. GDPR is the short form of the European Union's data governance, basically the right to be forgotten. So if you have a traveling European who comes and gets treated in Houston, does GDPR apply? I don't know. I know that with my passport, though, my constitution applies in their country. So GDPR is not just an over there problem. It'll become here as well. When do I need to be able to forget or turn that data off so that no one else can get access to it to allow that person their right to be forgotten? But it gets more fun than that. Because if you consider a bank, right? Suppose GDPR applies to a bank. What part of their data needs to be forgotten? Because I can guarantee you an accountant will pull their hair out and stomp their feet if you have forgotten a transaction. Where did the money go? So you can't forget all of the data, which gets us back to that technology about modeling. What part of the data is protected under GDPR? And what part's not? And how can I separate those systems so that I can have a meaningful conversation about transactions or surgeries or any number of other things that don't have to deal with the protected personal information? And then, of course, lastly, auditing and monitoring. We don't want to have a situation where the nurses checked on their friend and committed the HIPAA violation, and we can't tell. We need to be able to state firmly that we did, in fact, protect our customers and our patients. Which then gets us down to the most important aspect, which is the who. Because all of these have been talking about processes, and generally speaking, those will end up being words on a paper. But who is going to do that? People. For data governance, we need to keep a couple of really big players in mind. Who's the consumer? Data governance is supposed to be aimed at creating value out of the asset of the data you've collected. But for who? Whose value? How do they get it? You need to keep that in mind when you start down this path so that you can create a system that actually delivers that. Next up, though, everyone's had one of those meetings where we have a meeting and there was supposed to be a decision and we had to schedule another meeting because the decision didn't get made. Someone has to make the call. Someone has to be I am responsible for this. It's me. Even if the decision didn't go well, it's me. Your executive sponsor for these kind of efforts is absolutely necessary. Someone with sufficient clout and influence has to believe it's worth doing and spending the money to get there. What they want out of it is rather important then, isn't it? But also keeping them informed of the real constraints. Of course, with that, someone's going to actually have to do the work. Someone's going to have to administer the data governance systems. Who's responsible for checking on policy changes to who's allowed to access a certain record? If we don't know, the answer is no one, and we'll run into a lot of problems. So you have to have some kind of an administrator for this data governance program, maybe several. Likely with that person, you're going to want to have a group of advisors, because data governance, as we've already touched, almost immediately starts touching on multiple departments in your hospital. You'll have surgeries, anesthesiology, any number of things. Heck, even the dietitian might have a system that they need to manage and monitor. And being able to integrate and interoperate effectively as one delivery of service means that we need to understand the concerns they have. The dietitian probably doesn't care too much about names. They might care a whole lot about medical history, weight, maybe some genetic factors, and what room are they in so I can deliver the right food to that person. But knowing that that's their concern means I don't need to bring them into the conversation about, the creation and intake and billing and all these things, except where it interacts with their system. So the right people need to be in the room so we can make certain to meet their needs as well as some of their wants. And then lastly, and this one is perhaps the most important but the most overlooked, your stewards. Who are the people actually entering the data into your system? I've made allusions to a data entry clerk, but do you actually have data entry clerks? Or is it a nurse who happens to be working at the intake station, right? These people have to understand why you want them to change their job. You're putting more work on me. What value do I get out of it? Because this old system worked just fine for me. You have to be able to make that case. And you need to make certain they can actually do it. Because, for example, are you going to deny care to someone who is bleeding out because you couldn't get their name out of them? No! You're going to treat them first and then try and figure it out later. But you still need to have the ability to create some record to track this is the care we've delivered to that person. So how do you create the system that allows for appropriate exceptions that serves the needs of the data entry clerk, or in this case, the ER nurse who got unfortunately stuck with paperwork duty, as well as the consumer has to be able to look at statistics of what kind of people were coming into the ER, what treatments have been most effective. Which of course now gets us to, why is this important? Right? We're talking about turning data from a liability into an asset. How do we do this, and why would we want to? Well, let's deal with some of the unpleasant ones first. Vegetables before dessert. Regulation. Some places require it of us. And I don't mean just places across the pond. We've even got it happening in California. The Consumer Privacy Act of California, HIPAA, protected personal information, all of these regulations exist to keep people safe. Mostly the people we're serving. And we want to be able to do that better. That's why we want to turn the data from a liability to an asset. We don't want it just sitting there unprotected in plain text format where anybody who happens to get into my network or steals my hard drive can get it. All of these have to be handled not just for their protection, but for us to be able to actually produce the best level of service we could. This deals with the risk management aspect. Of course, there's the data quality, right? If I can't really trust that I did a good job capturing a reasonable digital twin of this person during intake, can I really do meaningful statistical work about the procedures they received and how effective they were? No, I kind of need that to be accurate. I need to be able to trust what I have in my system, both in terms of the actual data there, as well as the auditing data, to be confident about what I'm stating I have done with this asset or liability. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, we want to become a data-driven organization. It's one of the buzz phrases out right now. What does that mean? Data-driven would imply that I'm using the data sitting on some hard drive somewhere, the patterns I'm seeing there, to make decisions about what to do next. Do I need to build a new wing of the hospital? Do I really need to invest in this kind of an education program to help the community? What am I doing with that data deals with this. But you can't make a data-driven decision unless you trust the data and trust the system to keep the data so that you can keep making these decisions. But there's one more aspect. How are you going to get to the data so that you can make a decision? I can throw an Excel sheet at you But no one is going to make a decision purely on an Excel sheet. The cell has to have a meaning, some label, right? If I were doing a P&L, I would be dealing with profits and losses, and I saw a profit outweighing losses, like, great! But if I just saw one number big, one number small, I'd be left scratching my head and hoping that the loss was a small one. In the same way, we need to take that data from just being raw, here's information, facts about what happened in reality, and transform it with some context into something that's meaningful, a pattern, a relationship, some trend that's going on, so that in the context of this decision being made about this budget item or about this initiative, I now have a meaningful relationship or trend to point to. Hey, because we're seeing a rapid uptick in people coming in with pre-diabetes symptoms, we really should consider running this kind of initiative as a good investment. That conversation can only happen if I have the trend information that says people are coming in like that. But I can only get to that if I have a trusted source that's collecting the set of symptoms I'm seeing and can coordinate that across a large data set. So, why is it important? Business drivers, I want to start enabling a new behavior for my business, but that has to be built on a couple of really key foundations. I have to trust it, has to be high quality, I need to be able to get it so that I can interact with it in a meaningful way. Which deals with our value adds. I could reduce the time to go to a data meaningful decision if I had a good way to visualize it. I might be able to reduce costs if I notice that, hey, every time they go to this step, all of a sudden we get like double the cost because something goes wrong. What's up there? Now I have an opportunity to reduce the cost of care. That'd be very valuable. Consolidation, I can take from here is the information across 3 systems to single pane of glass. How do I know what happened to this person? From the anesthesiologist, the surgeon, dietitian, and registration, all of that. Now, you'll get to see some of these buzzwords, data culture, data ethics, data literacy. All of those deal with the people aspects, about how we create the culture inside of our organization to drive the behaviors of the data stewards and of the consumers in the direction that makes the data the asset. Because data sitting on a hard drive is just a thing. Maintaining it there, keeping it safe, that makes it a liability. Until people can get to it and use it and start applying it in decisions, it has not become an asset. All of that requires a mindset about what that thing on the disk is useful for. If my entire life I have looked at it and it's just a file that gets bigger and bigger and bigger every time I touch it, I'm not going to consider it like it's a viable something to go make a decision on until someone can show me otherwise. I have to create the culture where, oh, you can do that? Goes from being a question to, of course you can do that. And they start asking for it. But that also reveals one of the key pieces we need to keep in mind. Data governance is not a prescribed project. It will have this start date and this termination date. Certainly properties of it will do that. I need to adopt this technology. We need to roll out this system. That might be project-ish. But to really get the value for data governance, you're talking about a cultural transformation. The most closest analogy I have to those is an agile transformation, where the way people think about how business is always done has to move. Which means a lot of your work, the most important portion of your work, is not going to be on designing the process or picking the systems, but on enabling and training people. Which gets us with us both literacy of what is it that I'm talking about, what are my models, how do we as an organization talk about the customer's journey, the patient's journey through the hospital and their care, as well as the ethics of maybe just because she's my friend and she's in the ER, I shouldn't go look at her ER data. Now, let's talk about becoming data-driven, because there's, as with all forms of transformation, stages. Most people start in a data-neutral state. I mean, I've got it. It's mostly a liability. I might go grab some from one particular system when I need to know about it there. But otherwise, I generally don't pay any attention to it when I'm making a meaningful decision. Where did I set my stuff? There it is. The second step is data aware. So data neutral is it's there and I'm not really interacting with it. Data aware says I know it's there and I'm starting to try and grab from it to make better ideas and information. We use it to support business areas, to support that, yes, we need to get greater staffing in pharmacy because we're getting an increase in orders. And often the data quality has some trustworthiness issues. So I can't trust it too much because I know about 10% of the things that are coming in were double entered. Okay, that definitely would have an impact on me trying to make the play for I'd like to have more staff, please. Which is then where once we start resolving some of these issues, where we can start trusting the system more effectively, now we can take the step towards data critical, where we're starting to trust the data, and it's gotten this proven track record. Hey, we did this decision based upon the data, and it made a difference. We did it again, and it made another difference. And that's happening across multiple systems, or even across multiple departments, so that a wider conversation, can be had. But corporate buy-in is still a little finicky. They're starting to believe it for those areas that have done a good job cleaning up their data, that they believe they can gain the value from. But they're still a little cautious. But they are not quite to the point where they're willing to bet the farm on it, right? They don't want to bet the business strategy on the data patterns, because they don't trust it yet. We're starting to trust it more, and so they're willing to start using it for more decisions. And that strategy is the last point. Once data quality, integration, controls have reached the maturity that the corporation trusts them, the organization has had enough experience both using them, maintaining them, interacting with them, that, oh, okay, I get it. I can trust this thing, and it's not going to mislead me. It's not a wibbly-wobbly bridge. Now we can have data-driving strategy. Because I'm seeing this pattern, because we see this opportunity, the way for me to deliver value to the patient is this. That's the conversation at this stage. And the business usually considers that data as an asset. They want to protect it. They want to do more with it. Oftentimes, this is a moment where you can start seeing projects like AI and ML really start taking off. Because now that we have a trusted input source of information, machine learning and prediction on that becomes actually useful. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of numbers games, and I can't really trust it to be useful. And as a result, it's a high level of trust put in those data assets. But you have to build that trust in small ways. Now, some of those small ways probably look around like this. So we got a whole spectrum of the kind of value you can deliver. I want you to pay attention here, because the kind of things that you'll run into being asked of you during data governance changes or other projects can key you off to where that value can meaningfully be delivered. One of my favorite ones comes down here at visualization. I want to see it. Show me graphs. Well, I can show you graphs all day, but until I have things like intake, or even an API for getting that data back out, my graphs are going to be either very expensive to produce or somewhat questionable. We might want to do KPIs. I want to see how well each of the pharmacy techs are performing at doing their job. That's a wonderful thing to want, especially if you're trying to go through a lean process optimization. But if you can't measure it, if you can't trust it, if you can't, go and get it from the warehouse to look at it over time, what good is it? And so being able to look at where our piece comes in, from persisting it in the data lake or getting appropriate archival strategies for when I want to have this data ready access versus it's okay for it to take a bit, tells you about the layer of data governance that you're applying. You won't be able to make successful runs at KPIs or even at visualization until you have much greater confidence in all of the layers beneath it. Questions? Seeing a couple eyes come up. All right. So this then leads us to the fun question of, so why isn't everyone trying to pursue data governance? Right? I mean, it seems an obvious case. I have this liability just sitting around somewhere. I have to pay to protect it. I have to pay to keep it because the auditors are going to come after me if I don't. Why on earth would I not want to turn it into an asset? Great question. There are a couple of informations for why. Maybe there's not an actual regulatory requirement. Some areas don't have an audit. For example, when I was working as the third-party telemedicine provider, we don't have an audit because we don't keep copies of the data. We generate our report, and off it goes. You want a copy? It's over in your EMR system. And the only time it's available is in the transient flow through our system. And when it's there, it's encrypted and at rest. So we had solid proof there. We didn't have to go make that data an asset. But what if I wanted to improve and maybe make an AI or an ML tracking for when atrial fibrillation was happening? Maybe I want to start capturing that data for training purposes. Okay, there's an opportunity. There's also a cost. Of course, that gets us to the next piece, resource cost. Do you have people in your organization who could do this? Because if not, you're talking about hiring a potentially expensive outside consultancy who will probably tell you, yeah, we could do this, but you're going to need to change all of these, which means you have both an influence cost, because whoever goes to buy the project now has to convince others to participate in it. But there's also the money cost. It may not be worth that much to get from here to there. It is difficult to be able to paint that vision without someone who is able to see from the highest level how this impacts the entire category, which is, again, why that executive sponsor can become a godsend if we can enable them. And then, of course, the last piece deals with the culture. If you've been in business for a long time, the way business is done becomes the natural way to think. There's a lot of practice that goes into that, and then honestly, it's good. It allows you to do that job more effectively. That's just kind of how the brain works. Oh, I've been doing this long enough, that's just a pattern, don't even think about it anymore. But if you let that pattern stick, it creates challenges for trying to figure out what the next way of doing things could be. And we've all seen in our lifetimes how fast technology changed the world around us. I mean, just take a look at the last 3 years. There's no way we could do 100% work remote. Really? A lot of us had to. And for the most part, the world has now come back, and we're starting to actually get this interaction, and now we're in the question of, well, do we want to do hybrid? And how do we do hybrid effectively? That's in the span of 3 years. Imagine what's going to happen in a decade. Which brings us to, how do I get started? So suppose that just one of you walks out of here today and believes data governance is something that I think my organization should try. Fantastic. You're all that needs to get started. Start it like this. Find a way to articulate your purpose and your goal, right? We want to build a vision for a better future. Because what we're talking about here is, again, a transformation effort. You're going to need partners, stakeholders. Who will care that this happens? Who will gain value from it? How much would it be worth to them? And can I find a way to explain that in an elevator pitch, right? Can I explain in 5 minutes this big, hairy, audacious scheme for how we could make a better organization? With that, define what success looks like in concrete numbers. What impact to the bottom line, to the successful care of our customers and our patients, to the ease the doctor will have with using this system. What will success look like? And here I'm going to encourage you. Remember, this is a transformation. Don't set success at the 7-year mark, because you're going to run out of steam at year 2. Set victory points at each step. Find a meaningful chunk of work that could be delivered that doesn't have to go the whole way, and build it up as a sequence of steps. And then go back to your stakeholders and work it up with them. Because what you see and what they see may not be the same. But if you can't incorporate their vision, they may not buy in. Your goal with the stakeholders is to get that buy-in. And then assess it, right? Right now, we're looking at data governance from above the surface of the water. There is something really cool we could get over there. What's below the surface that would impede us getting there? Is there some rocky shoals over here? Is there a sudden deep trench right there that's going to scare people? What is between here and there, and what's the real state of my system? Maybe our data quality process is actually pretty good. We just don't apply it often enough. Maybe there's an existing process in place for auditing that you didn't know existed because you weren't part of that department yet. Great. Go and assess, find out what's going on. And then, with solid information about what is there, what could be, and what you believe a vision for success in the organization looks like, pull people together, create a board. Create the sense of commitment and ownership. Find your executive sponsor and let them own it. This one I always find to be a little bit tricky because, okay, what do you mean let them own it? It was my idea, yes. But do you have to be the front of it? Working through others is influence. Now I'll even bother with that, right? Leadership is the ability to get extraordinary results out of ordinary people. You don't have to be a titled person to lead. All it takes is you to have the idea and the conversations with the person who does have sufficient authority to make it the call, and then to keep helping them to win. At that point, you're leading, regardless of your title. And you want that ownership all the way through, because if someone doesn't feel this is mine, you can't expect the extra efforts that are going to be required. Because there's zero way we can, on paper, define all of the work that actually has to be done to make the effort successful. We need individuals to own this as my effort, something I want to succeed, so that they'll take the discretionary effort. Oh, we didn't talk about that, but I need to go handle it. Because without the, I'm going to go just get this covered because I see a gap, we're going to run into those gaps and no one will be there to fill them. Of course, with that, we'll need to start developing process. What does the life cycle of my data look like? Do I need to consider tombstoning? And for what portion of the model? How do I make certain that this model and that model can talk to each other? And as you do this, develop documentation. How are we going to get there? What's there right now? What's the model? How do I communicate that to the guy who's onboarding next month? Start figuring out how you're going to govern your data quality. Are you going to do it by consensus across 3 systems? And what's the consensus system look like? How do you do that? Do you have to manually go through each record? Do you have some special automation to do it? What? And as you build this effort, and as you start rolling it out, remember, people, process, technology. Here we've talked about the first group of people, the first team that wants to make this successful. But that first team has to go out to the organization to a bunch of second-level teams to make that successful. How do we get others who are going to be responsible for carrying this effort forward, able to talk about it meaningfully, advocate for it, why it's important for them to change their job like this, and enable them to do it? After all, every time I roll out a new software system, I have to roll out a training program with it. I can't just expect people to intuitively get it. I grew up with technology. I can probably tinker with it for 15 minutes and figure it out. But have y'all seen some of those entry systems? Everything is buried in a menu. So training and advocacy for whatever systems, whatever processes you build, have to go hand in hand. They have to go back to that, what is success? What is the goal? And how does it matter to me? Because if you can't connect to a narrative, to a story where the person doing the work is the hero, they're not going to be able to walk it down. We need to empower them to own it, because when they go back to their team, maybe they're the first person there who took that training. Is their opinion of that training going to make it more or less likely for people to take it after them? Imagine the story, right? I came in, I saw this. This is the future of the company, guys. You've got to go to this training. How many of you would go to that one? How many of you would go to, my God, we spent 4 hours staring at a PowerPoint, and I don't think even the speaker was awake. Right? That chuckle. Everyone knows I'm not going to that training either. Lastly, iterate. You're not going to get it right on the first pass. You're going to have a great idea to start with, but until you take a couple steps, you're not going to recognize where the real pinch points in your organization are. They're going to have pockets of resistance we didn't anticipate. Good. Don't assume that the plan you made is going to be the one that succeeds. Start a path. Inspect. Okay, so we found this new pocket of resistance. We found these people over here who actually really, really wanted it. It'd be really easy to go that way. Maybe we should shift a little bit. We'll get an easy win there. We can declare that to the company, and maybe that'll make it easier to shift back to these guys next year. Inspect and adapt, iterating yourself through a meaningful vision. Keep that vision out there. Keep trying to go for it, but don't assume that the steps you plan to get there are going to be the only ones you can use. Adjust to the situation as it comes in. Maybe there's a new law that Congress passes next year. And that changes how we have to approach it. Okay, take it into account. Just because the situation changed doesn't mean that your idea failed, but that we need to change. Inspect, adapt, adjust as you find it, and don't be afraid to go back to number 1 all the way through again. And build that assumption into your organization. We're going to start a journey towards data governance that will allow us to turn all of the information we have about our patients from a liability where we have to constantly protect it and we can do nothing with it, into an asset that allows us to become the next generation healthcare provider by providing novel services, ensuring that our communities have the education they need. Something like that can grab someone at their heart and they'll want to serve it. But build into that we're going to check again in a year to see where we're at, and we're going to adjust because our goal is to get to the value as we discover where we can. Now, with that, it's useful to have an ideal state in mind, right? You want to aim for things like a regular data governance board meeting. They need to meet regularly, and I'm not talking once a year either. Once a year is too late. Because what happens if a month from now something happens that changes how you have to deal with the rest of the year? Not good. Quarterly could probably be managed, but more regular than that can be useful, depending on people's schedules and the kind of acceleration you're experiencing. So don't be afraid to have that regular kind of shift in its definition as you go either. But definitely start more often than once a year so that people can keep in contact and in pulse of what's going on and what's important. You want to have well-defined and accepted data ownership. What department produces this information? What department is responsible for keeping it clean? Which data stewards are responsible for making certain that this record is accurate and attested when they put it into the system? And at what time? Because maybe, like we're talking with the ER, I'm going to start with John Doe. I don't know who this person is, but I'm assigning care to them. Later, when he comes and wakes up and he's okay again, now I can get the name. But I have to do that one in a week. Okay, that's a perfectly valid process, and I can agree and attest as the steward to own that. But having that conversation and having it documented so that the next time I onboard a guy, I can explain, hey, so if you run into this situation, here's how you handle it. Get your stuff into the system first, and then a week later, make certain you're cleaning up your paperwork, and you assign that name correctly so that so-and-so down the street can use it. You want to make certain you're documenting your process and what the quality aspects of it are, right? What does it mean to have a high-quality patient record? First name, last name, age, date of birth, place of residence. What stuff matters? Do you care if they have a flavor preference for the ice cream for the dietitian? That's probably not part of the quality piece. But it might be data that gets captured for some, feedback form. Find out what it means to have a high quality record. Write it down so that you can communicate it to others. Building on that, operationalize data transparency. This deals with the auditing and access management, right? What does it mean for a nurse in this department to have access to their patient records? Do they need access to the full patient history as the hospital knows it? How does the hospital get that data? How do we track who accessed it? This operationalized means that it's not kind of ad hoc, but it is part of how we do business. It's part of onboarding training. It's part of the regular checks. We have people come back and explain, hey guys, so here's how this audit training aligns with HIPAA, so that you can understand why for your job, this is how we're training you. And we're setting you up for success. And then lastly, regular training and communication around culture and literacy. The people who join your organization probably don't share your understanding of what data has become in the ideal state. Help them. What does the on-ramp from what data looks like generally in the industry to the vision of what we have it could be? And especially for our models, how do we talk about a patient? And when we do, what information are we talking about? When we talk about the communication and training for data culture, we're talking about that advocacy program. Who are the champions in each of your areas who say, this is something important for us to do, and I can articulate up and down how that's of value to the organization and to the people here. Because if you can't have them talking about what that is, it cannot become self-sustaining. Now, on the flip side, let's make certain you're aware of the risks. It can be a pain to balance new efforts on existing work. Everyone has had at least one situation, I'm sure, where they were working on a project and the boss says, hey, can you come handle this too? How many weekend plans is that screwed up? Getting the wrong balance on the implementation can be fatal to a process, because if you push one department too hard at the wrong time while they're in the middle of a busy season, because there are in fact those, the effort in that department could fail, and the repercussions can slow or even derail a data governance transformation. This is very heavily affected by buy-in, right? People want to care. They want to have something to care for, to care about, so that they can do meaningful work. Some of them, what they care about is a paycheck. That's true. Some of them, what they care about is serving a patient. They got into healthcare because they wanted to serve this specific group. Anytime we add data governance requirements that get in the way of that, we separate them further from the intrinsic rewards that they have. We want to be able to build that buy-in, help them see how the vision of what we're painting for the future in data governance links up to what they care about. We can't do that individually for everyone, which is why we need the champions, because they're closer to the people and can help generate continually the buy-in and maintain it. Because I could tell you about this right now, and 3 months from now, if you've done nothing with this information, are you still going to be excited about it? No, it'll be notes on a page maybe. You might remember, yeah, I got to have that lunch over at Improving. It was a neat place, but I don't remember what we talked about. There's a certain maintenance aspect that has to come from there. Now, critical with buy-in, poorly defined roles. Who is supposed to do that again? This is, again, back to who's on your team. What are they responsible for, and what does it mean for them to win? Your data stewards have to know that they're the data stewards and what's required of them to make the records accurate. The consumers have to understand all the work that's being done by the organization to support that win. Your executives need to understand the level of effort required to maintain the system, and if they're concerned with it, the appropriate way to bring those concerns, because nothing will quash an effort than an executive saying, I don't get it, why are we spending all this money? Unless we can answer that, and ideally, educate them in an effective way to ask that question. Because, yeah, if you're concerned for the amount of money it's taking, because it takes 6 hours for your guys to do it, maybe there's a training problem. Or maybe the system we used is not a good one. But you want to pull them in as partners, not as adversaries. And if we don't have well-defined roles and the ways we're going to interact, that social contract in place, we're not going to be able to get them there. Related to this, with poorly defined roles, poorly defined success. We'll know if we win because we'll be better at, okay, better how? Better why? I could say I'm better at it because I churned through more records, but I did it at the cost of my data quality because I skipped things, or I typoed, which would probably be my mistake. If we don't have meaningfully defined success criteria, what is the key performance indicator, both a leading indicator saying we're about to get to success, as well as the lagging indicator that says because we did this well, we are succeeding more here where it matters. If I can't articulate that in a measurable, defined, specific manner, I'm going to lose out on the ability to transform and on most of people's buy into the system, especially the executives who say, well, why am I spending my money there? Now, with that, you also need to consider, what about this ongoing training, this advocacy thing that we keep talking about? If you fail to have ongoing communication and training, new people into the organization will come in, people who've already been there will leave, and the overall level of your organization's ability to maintain this will drop back to the industry standard, into the industry norm, or the luck of the draw. You have to keep up the training, you have to make it sustainable, because no one wants to be doing training with all their time. And you have to continue to communicate the vision of why the company, why the organization, the hospital, is pursuing this with regard to some greater vision. Why does the hospital think making certain all of our patient records are accurate is a worthwhile expenditure of my time? If you can't communicate that, if you can't arm someone else to communicate it for you when you're not there, the effort will lose velocity. Which of course then comes down to the last piece, breaking workflow velocity. Right now, many hospitals are pretty finely tuned machines. They're continually looking for ways to make their process safer for the patients, fewer mislabeled drugs, no accidental administrations, making certain that this patient whose pain management is doing poorly right now gets seen by the specialist. If you break that workflow because it now takes a nurse 15 minutes rather than 5 to get data into the system, and your pain management specialist creates his schedule for the day 10 minutes ago, you're going to break the ability of the system to produce the value it was already supposed to. And your effort will be looked like a tax, not as the next implementation and investment. So when you're defining success, remember that preserving existing delivery may also be an important aspect. And unless you're very clear with your executive sponsor of, while we do this, there will be a tax while people come up and learn, there's going to be the loss of momentum again. There's going to be a loss of faith that the project could succeed. Now, with those risks in mind, I would be doing you a disservice if I did not point to a number of tools that you can start to look at. I do not recommend starting with your tools, but if you have an executive who likes shiny toys, toys can be a great way to start the conversation. Hey, look at what, hold on, Microsoft Azure Purview can give us. Hey, that's actually a really neat feature. Have you seen what the SAS data management can do? What about IBM? Being able to point to very specific tools about the features, the functions, the value that those tools have documented creating in other organizations can be a great way to bootstrap your ability to message it. So keep in mind that there are n number of tools, but your assessment will also inform what tools you start pursuing. If you're using an SAP system already, the SAP Data Hub might actually be a decent place to start. But if you're not, please don't go buy it, because it may not work for you. If your organization, your IT group, is already moving into Microsoft Azure in the cloud, maybe they can help you understand how much more it would take to get into Purview. But that comes and is informed by your assessment period for what is the lay of the land, what's already there, what tools are you using, and what is the experience of your organization with them. But with all of these, the secret to getting started secret of getting ahead is usually just getting started. All you need, you now have in your hands. You've come and seen what data governance could mean for your organization, and if you believe, the next step for you is to start conversations, to find the information you need to feel comfortable, bringing it to the people above you, or next to you as your peers, about what you could produce as an organization to make it so that you are more successful. If you're interested in learning more, I'd like to point you to these 3 big books. Remember how I told you that DAMA, the Data Administration Management Association, had books? Here they are. The DAMA DMBOK, Data Management Body of Knowledge, 2nd edition, is strongly recommended as a good place to start. There's, of course, one of the classic O'Reilly books on data management, also a great place to start. And then as a follow-up, either to the DMBOK or to your Data Governance Definitive Guide, also check out a book by the literal name Data Governance. We strongly recommend these as great places to start to extend your knowledge, but don't feel like you have to have read the book cover to cover to be able to get started. That's support information. This is the architecture you can use to get there and will be incredibly informative, but so will going out and doing it. To a degree, data governance starts with conversations between people like you and me about what it could be, about what value we could gain for our organizations, how we could better serve our patients, as well as how we can protect them better by understanding and treating our data like an asset worth protecting rather than a liability I have to maintain. Thank you for your time. Question? Ah, sir.
Can you get a copy of this presentation?
I would be happy to. Adriana, what's the best way for us to distribute that?
I'm sorry to hear that.
He asked for a copy of the presentation, the slides, right?
Yeah.
I think we were mentioning, I guess you and I were talking a little bit earlier about trying to have that ready in our website, the Defense website. I think maybe in about within...
Probably by the end of next week-ish. We should be able to get this recording trimmed up properly and available to Adriana for upload.
Okay.
And we'll set up communication out when that becomes available to everyone.
Yeah. Other questions? How can I help? Alrighty. Well, thank you guys for attending. We enjoyed having you. If you guys want to, connect later, I've left some business cards out here, so grab them. You can send me questions, and if I don't know the answer, I'll go talk to someone who I think does. Thank you all very much for coming. We enjoyed having you.